The nursery was a masterpiece of soft, muted tones, the kind of sanctuary that existed only in dreams during Dae-hyun's fractured childhood. Warm, cream-colored silks draped the walls, and the air held the faint, sweet scent of lavender and expensive cedar. In the center of the room stood a handcrafted bassinet, light and airy, waiting for the heir who would finally carry the Han name without the weight of its sins. Zara stood by the window, her hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her stomach, watching the sunset paint the Seoul skyline in hues of bruised violet and gold. For the first time, the penthouse felt like a home rather than a fortress. But peace, in their world, was often just a precursor to a more sophisticated violence. The disruption came not with a crash, yes, but with the silent arrival of a delivery that had bypassed 3 layers of security. A feat that should have been impossible. When Dae-hyun entered the room, his face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. Behind him, 2 guards carried a heavy object draped in a black velvet shroud. They set it down in the center of the nursery, the weight of it causing the floorboards to groan beneath the plush carpet. "Get out!" Dae-hyun commanded his men, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. Once the doors clicked shut, he reached for the velvet. Zara moved to his side, her unblinking gaze fixed on the fabric. With a sharp tug, Dae-hyun revealed the gift. It wasn't the light wooden cradle they had ordered. It was an iron monstrosity, cold and jagged, forged from the melted-down metal of the old syndicate's armory. The iron was dark, smelling of oil and ancient rust, and its frame was etched with meticulous, cruel precision. Zara leaned closer, her breath hitching. Around the rim of the cradle, a list of names had been engraved into the metal, names of the men Dae-hyun had buried to secure his throne. Elder Shin, the Atagiri lieutenants, the traitors from the safe room. It was a ledger of death, a reminder that the foundation of their new life was built on a graveyard. At the foot of the iron cradle, a new space had been polished smooth, left blank for the name of the child yet to be born. Dae-hyun's hand brushed the cold metal, his thumb tracing the name of his own father, which sat at the very top of the list. The silver in his hair seemed to catch the dying light, making him look like the specter he had fought so hard to outrun. The psychological armor he had built with Zara's help didn't shatter, but it shuddered. The message was unmistakable. A child born to a monster would always be cradled in iron. "They think they can define him before he even breathes," Dae-hyun whispered, his tattooed knuckles turning white as he gripped the iron rail. "They think the blood never dries." Zara didn't recoil from the omen. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand over Dae-hyun's, her warmth a stark contrast to the freezing metal. She looked at the iron cradle, then up at her husband, her eyes hard and predatory. "They sent this to remind us of who we were," she said, her voice dropping to that low, lethal vibrato that had cowed the uncles. "But all they've done is remind us of why we have to destroy them. They want an heir of iron, Dae-hyun? I will give them a king who knows how to melt it down." The dark omen sat in the center of their sanctuary, a jagged piece of the past infecting the future. The iron cradle had arrived, and with it, the realization that the war for their legacy was no longer about shipping lanes or boardroom votes. It was about the soul of their child, and the wolves were already at the door. The penthouse, once a symbol of their shared victory, had transformed into a shimmering, high-tech reliquary. Following the arrival of the iron cradle, Dae-hyun had tightened the perimeter until the very air seemed to hum with the static of surveillance. Every window was now reinforced with ballistic glass that distorted the Seoul skyline into a fractured mosaic, and the hallways were patrolled by silent, suit-clad shadows whose only purpose was to monitor the rhythm of Zara's life. To the world, she was the most protected woman in Asia. To Zara, she was a prisoner in a suit of gold. As her pregnancy reached its 7th month, the physical weight of the child was matched only by the suffocating pressure of her husband's fear. Zara stood in the center of the living room, her fingers tracing the edge of a mahogany table. She wanted to walk on the terrace, to feel the bite of the winter wind against her skin, but the sensors would trigger a security lockdown the moment the latch was turned. "The biometric scan is for your vitals, Zara. Just a precaution," Dae-hyun had said that morning, his voice a low, soothing murmur that didn't quite hide the jagged edge of his anxiety. He had traded his blue suit for a silk robe, but his eyes were never at rest. They were always darting toward the monitors, scanning for a ghost that might bypass the gates. She watched him now through the open door of the study. He was a man obsessed, poring over satellite feeds and loyalty reports, as if he could manifest a shield through sheer force of will. The no-touch ghost of his past had been replaced by a no-risk compulsion. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but in doing so, he had locked her in a space where her only identity was her vulnerability. "I am not a porcelain doll, Dae-hyun," she said, her voice echoing in the minimalist expanse of the room. It wasn't a plea, it was a cold statement of fact. He looked up, the blue light of the screens reflecting in his silver hair. "You are the mother of the Han heir. To them, you are a target. To me, you are the only reason the sun rises. There is no middle ground." "There is the ground I used to walk on," Zara countered, stepping toward him. Each step was a defiance of the invisible lines the security team had drawn. "I helped you take this empire because I was your partner, not your prize. These guards don't report to me. These cameras don't look for my enemies. They watch my every breath to make sure I'm still yours." The tension between them was a physical cord, stretched to the point of snapping. Zara felt the child stir within her, a sharp, sudden kick that felt like a demand for space. She realized then that the young wolves in the streets weren't the only ones feeling restless. By attempting to insulate her from the blood of the syndicate, Dae-hyun was accidentally recreating the very isolation that had broken him as a child. She turned away from the monitors, her gaze settling on the heavy, reinforced door of the penthouse. The gold leaf and polished wood couldn't hide the fact that it was a vault. She was the architect of their legitimate expansion, the mind that had outmaneuvered the Otagiri. Yet here she was, reduced to a heart rate on a screen. "The cradle was iron to remind us of the past," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "But this room is gold to make us forget we're still in a cage." She knew the piece was a lie. The more Dae-hyun tried to control the environment, the more he invited the chaos to find a way in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, barred shadows across the floor, Zara realized that if she didn't find a way to break the gilded cage herself, the wolves wouldn't even need to bark at the door. They would simply wait for the cage to become a coffin. While Zara paced the high-altitude silence of the penthouse, the streets of Seoul were beginning to ferment with a different kind of restlessness. In the rain-slicked back alleys of Gangnam and the dimly lit shipping offices of Busan, a new generation was rising. Men who had never bowed to Dae-hyun's father and felt no loyalty to the legitimacy Zara had spent months architecting. They called themselves the Young Wolves, led by a man named Jun-ho, a former protege of the late Elder Shin who possessed a silver tongue and a heart made of cold industrial grit. To them, the Han Group's move into legal shipping wasn't progress. It was an abdication of the throne. The first signs of the fracture were subtle. A missed check-in from a port foreman, and a slight discrepancy in the Northern Territory's ledgers. But by the second week of the winter freeze, the disobedience turned blatant. Jun-ho sat in a smoke-filled basement club, surrounded by lieutenants who looked more like street racers than traditional syndicate soldiers. On the table before them lay a direct order from the penthouse, signed with the Han seal, demanding the immediate cessation of high-interest predatory lending in the garment district. Jun-ho didn't read it. He simply used the edge of the document to ash his cigarette before tearing it slowly down the middle. "The boss is sitting in a nursery counting silk blankets," Jun-ho said, his voice a gravelly sneer that elicited a chorus of dark laughter. "He's forgotten that the only reason those shipping containers move without being hijacked is because the world remembers the monster. Now, he lets a woman tell us how to spend our money. He's trading our teeth for a corporate logo." The young wolves were a faction born of impatience and a hunger for the old ways. They didn't want the long-term stability of a global logistics firm. They wanted the immediate, visceral rush of the streets. When a shipment of high-end electronics arrived at the Incheon docks, cargo intended for a legitimate European contract, the wolves didn't facilitate its transport. They diverted it. They sold it on the black market under a rival's flag, a deliberate act of sabotage designed to humiliate the Han Group's new corporate face. In the penthouse, the reports of the theft hit Dae-hyun's desk like a physical blow. He sat in his blue suit, the fabric pulling tight across his broad shoulders as he read the intelligence. The insubordination was a direct challenge to his authority, but it was more than that. It was a threat to the safety he had promised Zara. If he didn't crush the wolves, the legitimacy she had built would be revealed as a paper shield. "They're testing the leash, Dae-hyun," Zara said, standing in the doorway of his study. She didn't need to read the report. She could see the familiar, predatory tension returning to the line of his jaw. "They think because I'm carrying an heir, you've lost your edge. They think the Han Group has gone soft because we've stopped bleeding the city." Dae-hyun looked up, his silver hair shimmering under the cold LED lights. "They want the monster," he said, his voice dropping into that low, terrifying register that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. "They think they want to see what my father made, but they don't realize that the monster didn't disappear. It just found something worth protecting." He stood, the blue of his suit looking dark, almost black in the shadows of the room. The young wolves had made a fatal mistake. They had mistaken his desire for peace for a lack of capacity for war. By disobeying the new order, they hadn't just challenged a CEO, they had poked a sleeping dragon who was now guarding a cradle. The schism had begun, and as the first rogue fires were lit in the docks of Incheon, the streets of Seoul prepared for a winter that would be measured in blood, not snow. The private maternity clinic was a cathedral of sterile glass and quiet privilege, tucked away in the hills of Cheongdam-dong. But it was supposed to be the one place where the stench of the streets couldn't reach, a neutral zone where Zara could simply be a woman expecting a child rather than the strategist of a global empire. But as the elevator ascended to the executive floor, the air felt thin, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on Dae-hyun's neck stand at attention. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, his hand never leaving the small of Zara's back, his gaze constantly dissecting the reflections in the polished marble walls. The routine ultrasound was meant to be a moment of respite, a glimpse into the heartbeat of their future. Instead, the violence arrived with the clinical precision of a scalpel. They were halfway down the corridor when the fire suppression system suddenly hissed to life, not with water, but with a blinding, chemical fog that turned the hallway into a white void. In the sudden opacity, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire. The young wolves hadn't come for a negotiation, they had come to cut the Han line at its root. Dae-hyun's reaction was instinctive, a return to the muscle memory of a man who had survived 1,000 shadows. In one fluid motion, he pulled Zara into a recessed doorway, his body becoming a human shield against the spray of glass as the clinic's windows shattered inward. He didn't reach for a phone to call the security detail. He reached for the heavy, silver-plated pistol concealed at his hip, his tattooed fingers finding the grip with a lover's familiarity. "Stay down," he growled, his voice a low, primal vibration that cut through the hiss of the fog. Two figures emerged from the white haze, dressed in the tactical gear of high-end mercenaries, but wearing the signature crimson armbands of Junho's rogue faction. They moved with the arrogance of youth, thinking they had caught the lion in a trap of his own sentimentality. They were wrong. Dae-hyun stepped into the line of fire, his navy suit a blur of dark motion. He didn't fire wildly, he moved with a cold, predatory economy. 2 shots rang out, muffled by the fog, and the 2 figures collapsed before they could even level their weapons. Zara sat on the floor, her hands protectively cradling her stomach, her unblinking gaze fixed on the man she had married. She didn't see the panicked husband she had lived with in the penthouse. She saw the sovereign. The monster hadn't been awakened. It had been refined. Daehyun stood over the fallen men, the blue light of the emergency strobes dancing in his silver hair, his face a mask of absolute terrifying clarity. "They touched the clinic, Zara," he whispered, though the words felt like they were being dragged over gravel. "They thought the white walls would make me hesitate." He reached down, his hand steady as he helped her to her feet. The white floor was stained with more than just chemical foam. A streak of red marked the path of the failed assassins. The piece they had tried to build was a shattered illusion, a glass house that had finally come down around them. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Daehyun pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number he hadn't touched since the purge of the uncles. "Gather the old guard," he commanded, his eyes locking onto Zara's. "Tell them the legitimate expansion is on hold. We are going back to the steel." The red alert wasn't just a security protocol, it was a shift in their very souls. As they were escorted out of the building by a frantic, reinforced security team, Zara didn't look back at the shattered sanctuary. She looked at Daehyun's hands, the hands that would soon be stained to ensure their child's world stayed clean. The war footing was no longer a precaution, it was their new reality. The blood on the clinic floor had barely dried before Zara reclaimed her position at the center of the Han Group's digital nervous system. If the hospital attack was meant to terrify her into a state of frail dependency, Junho had fundamentally miscalculated the woman who had once cleaned floors while memorizing the secrets of the powerful. She did not retreat into the soft silks of the nursery. Instead, she transformed the penthouse's secondary office into a command center that hummed with the predatory energy of a high-stakes trading floor. While Daehyun prepared for the physical purge, Zara set out to commit a more bloodless, but far more devastating kind of execution. She sat behind a bank of monitors, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of global ledgers and encrypted offshore accounts. To the young wolves, money was something to be stolen or spent on flashy cars and basement clubs. To Zara, money was oxygen, and she was about to suck the air out of every room they stood in. "They think they can fund a revolution with hijacked electronics and street-level extortion," Zara murmured, her voice a calm, lethal vibrato as her fingers danced across the keys. "They don't realize that the very black market they rely on is built on the infrastructure I legalized." With a series of sharp tactical keystrokes, she initiated the Queen's Gambit. She didn't just freeze the rogue faction's accounts. She did something far more surgical. She manipulated the regional shipping manifests to ensure that every vessel currently carrying the wolves' illicit goods was flagged for administrative inspection by international maritime authorities. In a single hour, Junho's projected revenue for the quarter vanished into a black hole of bureaucratic red tape. Next, she turned her sights on their local creditors. The young wolves relied on a network of underground lenders and shell companies to keep their street operations liquid. Zara didn't threaten these lenders with violence. She offered them a seat at the legitimate table. She opened the Han Group's prime credit lines to any broker who would immediately call in the wolves' debts. By noon, the rebellious faction went from a well-funded insurgency to a group of desperate debtors whose phones were ringing with demands they couldn't possibly meet. Daehyun entered the room, his dark navy suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink on his forearms. He watched her for a moment, seeing the unblinking focus in her eyes, the same look she had worn when they first faced the uncles. He saw that while he was readying the steel, she had already cut the ground out from under their feet. "You're starving them," he observed, leaning against the doorframe. "A wolf can't hunt if it's too weak to run, Daehyun," Zara replied, not taking her eyes from the screen as she authorized a final massive short sell on a company Junho used to launder his garment district earnings. By tomorrow morning, they won't be able to pay for their fuel, their ammunition, or their loyalty. They wanted to return to the old ways, but they forgot that in the old ways, the person with the gold held the leash. She turned the chair toward him, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach, a gesture that was both maternal and fiercely territorial. The transition from the gilded cage was complete. She was no longer a target. She was the architect of their ruin. The young wolves had tried to take her life in a white hallway, but she was taking their future from a computer screen. "The streets are going to get hungry, Dae-hyun," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And when a wolf is hungry enough, it stops looking for a king and starts looking for a meal. They'll turn on Junho before the week is out." Dae-hyun nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. The war footing was total. Between his sword and her mind, the Iron Cradle was becoming the most secure place on Earth. The penthouse was a cathedral of cold light and silent calculations, but within the marrow of Dae-hyun's bones, an older, more primal rhythm was beginning to beat. He stood in the center of the private gym, his navy dress shirt discarded, sweat glistening over the sprawling ink of the dragons that coiled around his torso. In his hand, he balanced a simple, weighted steel baton, not the elegant weapon of a CEO, but the blunt instrument of a street enforcer. Every time he struck the heavy bag, the sound echoed like a gunshot, a physical manifestation of the pressure building behind his ribs. Zara's financial starvation of the young wolves was working with a surgical beauty, but as the reports of Junho's growing desperation filtered in, Dae-hyun felt a familiar, poisoned hunger rising in his own gut. It was the blood tie, the ancestral urge to stop negotiating with shadows and start erasing them. His father's voice, a ghost he thought he had buried in the Osaka tea house, began to whisper in the quiet moments. "Legitimacy is a luxury for the peaceful. For us, there is only the hammer." He looked at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, the silver hair, the scarred knuckles, the eyes that had seen too much darkness to ever be truly light. He saw the man who had protected Zara at the clinic, but he also saw the shadow of the patriarch who had once broken a 12-year-old girl just to prove a point. The line between protecting his family and becoming the monster he feared was thinning, worn down by the constant friction of the wolves' provocations. Zara entered the gym, her presence a soft contrast to the room's aggressive energy. She watched him for a long moment, noting the way he gripped the steel until his tattooed forearms pulsed. She knew the struggle wasn't against Junho, it was against the ghost in his DNA. "You're hitting it as if you want to kill the air, Dae-hyun," she said, her voice a cool, stabilizing frequency. He stopped, the baton trembling slightly in his hand. He didn't turn around. "Junho sent a photograph to my personal encrypted line this morning. It wasn't of the docks or the ships. Man, it was a long lens shot of you through the nursery window." The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of ozone and impending lightning. Dae-hyun finally turned, his eyes burning with a dark predatory fire that made the blue light of the room feel cold. "My father wouldn't have used a queen's gambit, Zara. He would have found every person Junho ever loved and made them disappear by sunset. And right now, I can feel how easy it would be to do the same." This was the true test of the Iron Cradle. The wolves weren't just outside the door, they were inside his blood, tempting him to trade his hard-won humanity for the efficiency of a slaughter. If he surrendered to the urge, he might save the child, but he would give that child a father who was nothing more than a ghost of the man he was supposed to be. Zara walked toward him, ignoring the dangerous vibration radiating from his frame. She took the steel baton from his hand and set it on the floor. She placed his hand over her stomach, forcing him to feel the steady, rhythmic life that was oblivious to the war in the streets. "If you become your father to save this child, you've already lost," she whispered, her unblinking gaze locking onto his. "The wolves want the monster because they know how to fight a monster. They don't know how to fight a king. Don't give them the satisfaction of proving that the Han blood only knows how to destroy." Dae-hyun closed his eyes, his breath hitching as he felt the kick of his air against his palm. The blood tie was strong, a heavy chain pulling him toward the dark, but Zara was the anchor that kept him in the light. He pulled her close, his face buried in the crook of her neck, the dragon tattoos on his arms finally still. He would end this, but he would do it on his own terms, not as his father's son, but as the man Zara had built from the ruins. The winter storm that had been bruising the Seoul skyline finally broke, bringing with it a sudden, unnatural stillness. It began not with a sound, but with the death of the city's hum. One by one, the glowing grids of the surrounding skyscrapers flickered and died, swallowed by a coordinated blackout that plunged the district into a pre-industrial dark. Inside the penthouse, the rhythmic pulse of the security monitors flatlined. The ambient blue light of Zara's command center vanished, replaced by the suffocating weight of total shadow. The silent night had begun, and with the failure of the primary power grid, the gilded cage had become a pitch-black labyrinth. Dae-hyun didn't need eyes to see the shape of the threat. The moment the air conditioning stopped its low whine, he felt the shift in the building's pressure. The elevators were dead, but the service stairs were now a vertical artery for the young wolves. He reached out in the dark, his hand finding Zara's shoulder with unerring precision. He didn't speak. The time for strategy had passed, and the time for the blade had arrived. "The auxiliary power has been jammed," Zara whispered, her voice a calm, clinical thread in the darkness. She wasn't afraid. She was calculating. She could hear the muffled thud of tactical boots echoing through the ventilation shafts. "They aren't coming for the ledgers anymore. They're coming for the cradle." Dae-hyun pulled a sleek, isothermal imaging monocle from his belt, the faint green glow illuminating the sharp, predatory lines of his face. He was back in his navy suit, but the elegance was gone, replaced by the grim utility of a man preparing for a slaughter. He handed Zara a compact submachine gun, its weight familiar and cold in her hands. "Stay in the reinforced core of the nursery," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "If the door opens and it isn't me, you don't hesitate. You burn the room down." The first breach happened at the terrace. The ballistic glass, designed to withstand a sniper's round, shattered under the concentrated blast of a thermal charge. 3 shadows drifted into the living room, their silhouettes framed by the ghostly white of the falling snow outside. They moved with the frantic energy of the hungry. Their weapons swept low. They thought the dark was their ally, but they had forgotten that Dae-hyun had been born in the shadows of a monster's house. He moved through the open-plan living room like a wraith, his footsteps silenced by the plush carpet. He didn't fire his weapon. A muzzle flash would give away his position. Instead, he used the steel baton Zara had taken from him earlier, reclaimed now for its silent efficiency. He took the first wolf from behind, a sharp, surgical strike to the base of the skull that sent the man to the floor without a sound. The second turned just as Dae-hyun's blade, a gift from the Otagiri Wars, found the seam in his tactical vest. The penthouse had become a vertical battlefield, a place of high-altitude violence where the only law was survival. In the nursery, Zara sat in the iron cradle's shadow, her unblinking gaze fixed on the heavy oak door. She could hear the muffled grunts of combat, the wet slide of steel, and the heavy thuds of bodies falling in the hallway. Each sound was a tally of the price they were paying for their legacy. The door to the nursery groaned as someone threw their weight against it. Zara leveled her weapon, her finger tightening on the trigger, her heart beating a steady, defiant rhythm against the life growing inside her. But the door didn't give. Instead, the sound of a final, desperate struggle echoed from the other side, followed by a long, harrowing silence. When the door finally slid open, it was Dae-hyun. He stood in the threshold, his navy suit torn at the shoulder, a streak of dark blood cutting across the silver of his hair. He didn't look like a CEO or a husband. He looked like the survivor of a shipwreck. He scanned the room, his gaze only softening when it landed on Zara, still poised and lethal in the dark. "It's over," he rasped, his breathing heavy and ragged. "The vanguard is dead, but Junho isn't among them. He's fled to the countryside, to the ancestral estate." The blackout remained, the city below a silent grave of stone and ice. But as they stood together in the ruins of their sanctuary, the message was clear. The penthouse was no longer safe. The final exorcism wouldn't happen in the clouds. It would happen in the dirt of the Han family's past. The journey into the mountains was a descent into the frozen heart of the Han legacy. As the armored SUV wound its way through the jagged, snow-dusted peaks, the neon pulse of Seoul faded into a distant, ghostly glow. The ancestral estate sat like a stone monolith atop a windswept ridge, a sprawling fortress of dark timber and gray tile that had housed 3 generations of monsters. It was a place of deep shadows and cold hearths, where the wind through the pines sounded like the whispering of the dead. For Dae-hyun, returning here was like walking back into a nightmare he had spent his entire life trying to wake up from. But the city was no longer a sanctuary, and the wolves were closing in. They arrived under the cover of a biting sleet that turned the winding driveway into a ribbon of black ice. Dae-hyun stepped out of the vehicle, his navy suit now hidden under a heavy charcoal overcoat, his silver hair whipped by the gale. He reached back for Zara, his grip firm and possessive. She emerged with her unblinking gaze fixed on the fortress, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach beneath her furs. She could feel the history of the place, the lingering scent of old smoke, and the heavy, stagnant air of a dynasty built on the silence of its victims. "The old guard is stationed at the gatehouses," Dae-hyun murmured, his breath hitching in the frigid air. "The sensors are active. Nothing moves on this mountain without me knowing." But as they crossed the threshold of the main hall, the silence of the estate felt wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a retreat. It was the hollowed-out silence of a trap that had already snapped shut. The air smelled faintly of kerosene and something metallic, not the scent of age, but the sharp, acidic tang of modern propellant. Dae-hyun stopped in the center of the great hall, beneath the faded portrait of his father. His hand went instinctively to the small of Zara's back, pulling her into the shadow of a massive stone pillar. The thermal imaging monocle hummed as he brought it to his eye, and the world bloomed into a ghostly palette of heat and shadow. He saw them then. Not outside in the snow, but within the very walls of his history. The young wolves hadn't followed them to the estate. They had arrived first. They had turned the Han family's hollowed-out heart into their own bunker. Junho's voice drifted down from the upper gallery, distorted by the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling. It was a jagged, mocking sound that echoed off the portraits of dead men. "Welcome home, boss. We thought we'd save you the trouble of inviting us. You always said this place was built on the blood of the loyal. We figured it was time for a refill." Suddenly, the paper screens lining the hall were illuminated from behind, revealing the silhouettes of a dozen armed men. They weren't the old guard Dae-hyun had trusted to hold the perimeter. They were the new generation, the hungry ones who had traded their loyalty for the promise of a world without rules. The retreat had become a siege. Zara's fingers dug into Dae-hyun's arm, her mind already cataloging the exits, the blind spots, and the weight of the submachine gun still hidden in her wrap. She looked at the iron-cold eyes of her husband and saw the reflection of the mountain itself, hard, unforgiving, and ancient. "They think the house belongs to whoever holds the keys," Zara whispered, her voice a low, lethal vibrato that ignored the rifles pointed at their hearts. "They forgot that the house belongs to the ghosts. And you're the only one who knows how to talk to them." Dae-hyun didn't flinch. He looked up at the gallery where Junho stood, a dark shape against the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. The battle for the Iron Cradle had moved from the clouds of the city to the dirt of the ancestors, and as the first wolf stepped out from behind a screen, the navy blue of Dae-hyun's suit seemed to absorb the shadows, readying itself for the blood that was about to stain the ancestral floor. The great hall of the Han estate was a cavern of flickering shadows, the air heavy with the scent of pine needles and the cold, sharp tang of impending violence. Junho stepped forward onto the polished wood of the gallery, his face twisted into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, the look of a man who believed he had finally cornered a god. Below him, Dae-hyun stood motionless, the charcoal overcoat discarded to reveal the sharp navy lines of his suit. He looked small against the vastness of the ancestral architecture, but the stillness radiating from him was more terrifying than any roar. "Look at you," Junho spat, his voice echoing off the beams. "The sovereign of Seoul, standing in the dirt of his fathers, protecting a maid and a belly. My men are hungry, Dae-hyun. They don't want shipping manifests. They want the monster that built this house. Give us a reason to fear you or get out of the way." The young wolves shifted in the shadows, their fingers itching on their triggers. They expected a bloodbath. They expected Daehyun to lung, to fire, to become the butcher his father had been. But Daehyun didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small encrypted tablet, its screen a cold blue beacon in the dimness. "Fear is a cheap commodity, Junho," Daehyun said, his voice a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "My father used it because he was a man of limited imagination. He thought a body in the ground was the only way to end a debt. But I have spent the last 6 hours teaching you a different lesson." He tapped the screen. Suddenly, the phones in the pockets of the men in the shadows began to chime, a discordant digital chorus. One by one, the young wolves pulled out their devices, their faces paling as they read the messages. "You think you're here for a coup?" Daehyun continued, stepping forward into the center of the hall, his unblinking gaze never leaving Junho. "But while you were hiking up this mountain, the Han Foundation was buying your family's debts. We've secured the deeds to your parents' apartments. We've placed the scholarships of your siblings into trust funds that freeze the moment a shot is fired in this room. I'm not going to kill you for sport. I'm going to make sure that if you pull that trigger, you aren't just an assassin. You're the man who made your own mother homeless." The tension in the room shifted from predatory to paralyzed. The young wolves weren't soldiers of fortune. They were products of the very system Zara and Daehyun had begun to dismantle. They had families, futures, and weaknesses that had nothing to do with bullets. Zara stood by the pillar, her hand resting on her stomach, watching the psychological dominance take hold. She saw the rifles start to dip. She saw the realization dawn on them. They weren't fighting a monster. They were fighting a god who owned the air they breathed. "You're bluffing!" Junho screamed, his voice cracking as he saw his power evaporating. He leveled his pistol at Daehyun's head, his hand shaking. "This is the Han house. We do things with blood here." "The blood is dry, Junho," Daehyun said, and for the first time he smiled, a small, sad expression of absolute victory. "The cycle ends with me. I don't need to kill you to destroy you. You're already forgotten." One by one, the men in the shadows stepped back. They didn't flee. They simply ceased to be an army. They became employees again, terrified of the man who held their lives in a digital ledger. Junho looked around, his eyes wild, realizing he was standing alone on a gallery of ghosts. He slumped against the railing, the pistol slipping from his nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor below. Daehyun didn't even look at the fallen weapon. He turned his back on the gallery and walked toward Zara, his silver hair catching the first light of dawn breaking through the high windows. The cycle of the Han family, the endless rhythmic beat of violence, had been broken not by a hammer, but by a choice. As he reached for Zara's hand, the ancestral estate felt less like a fortress and more like a ruin, its purpose finally served. The spring thaw had finally come to Seoul, washing away the gray grit of winter and replacing it with the fragile, insistent green of new life. In the master suite of the penthouse, the air was no longer thick with the scent of ozone and gun oil, but with the crisp, clean aroma of white lilies and the sterile, hopeful promise of a new beginning. The heavy ballistic shutters were retracted, allowing the morning sun to flood the room in a warmth that felt earned rather than purchased. Daehyun sat by the window, his navy suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon tattoos that seemed to have finally stilled upon his skin. He watched the city below, no longer seeing a battlefield to be conquered, but a landscape to be built. The monster had been buried in the mountain soil of the ancestral estate, left behind in the dark along with the iron cradle and the ghosts of men who only knew how to rule through fear. He was a man of the light now, a transition marked by the steady, rhythmic breathing of the woman in the bed behind him. Zara stirred, and her face pale but radiant in the soft light. The ordeal of the night had passed, leaving in its wake a silence that was profound and holy. In her arms, wrapped in the finest organic cotton, lay the future of the Han line. The child was small, a delicate miracle of soft skin and dark hair, oblivious to the wars that had been fought to ensure his first breath was taken in a world of peace. He did not cry. He simply existed, a quiet testament to the fact that blood did not have to dictate destiny. Daehyun moved to the bedside, his movements fluid and gentle. He looked down at his son, and for the first time in his life, his hands did not tremble with the weight of his father's legacy. He reached out, his tattooed index finger brushing against the infant's tiny palm. The child's hand closed around his finger with a strength that felt like a coronation. "He has your eyes," Daehyun whispered, his voice thick with a raw, unfiltered emotion that would have been unrecognizable to the man he was a year ago. "He has the look of someone who expects the world to be kind." Zara smiled, her unblinking gaze fixed on their son. "He expects it because we made it so, Daehyun. The cold line is gone. He is the first of a new house." The monster name had been officially retired, scrubbed from the ledgers of the city and the memories of the streets. The Han Foundation was now a beacon of legitimate industry, its roots no longer watered by the blood of the desperate, but by the vision of a woman who had dared to clean a monster's house until it became a home. There would be no iron cradle for this heir, no ledger of enemies to be memorized, no shadows to fear in the hallway. Daehyun leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to Zara's forehead before settling beside them. He felt the weight of the past finally lift, replaced by the beautiful, terrifying responsibility of the future. The city of Seoul buzzed outside, a sprawling metropolis of millions, but inside this room, the world had shrunk to the size of a single, steady heartbeat. The first breath had been taken, the cycle was broken, and as the sun climbed higher into the clear blue sky, the sovereign couple finally closed their eyes, resting in the warmth of a legacy that was, at last, truly clean.